Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Morrison. The whisper you hear in the dark is not the wind. It is the language the past has chosen to speak with you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you don't get lost in the darkness. Now, the story begins. Get ready. The isolation of void, a night in the Belgian facility. The air inside the Level 4 containment unit in Antwerp does not merely linger, it oppresses. It is a sterile, pressurized vacuum that tastes of recycled nitrogen and the sharp, metallic tang of a dying electric current. My name is Dr. Elias, and I have spent the last 72 hours inside this glass and steel cage. We were told we were isolating a rare chemical pathogen discovered in the North Sea, but as I watched the walls of the quarantine chamber begin to bleed a dark, translucent mineral, I realized the presence we have trapped is not biological. It is a paranormal frequency that has decided to rewrite the laws of matter. It started at 3 a.m. The heavy lead-lined doors did not just seal. They fused into the frame, becoming a single seamless block of obsidian. The temperature plummeted into a stagnant hollow frost that smelled of scorched ozone and parched ancient stone. I felt the resonance, a high-pitched vibration rising from the very floorboards. A frequency from a plane of existence that ignores the linear passage of time. This was not a medical crisis. This was a terminal, opening in the heart of Belgium. I shone my diagnostic light toward the ventilation shaft. The beam was distorted, bending as if the atmosphere had turned into thick, invisible oil. From the vents, a black liquid shadow began to seep. It did not flow like a gas. It pulsed like a slow, rhythmic heart. From this darkness, a figure manifested, the warden of the absolute silence. It was a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mercury. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the sterile glare of the lab. This was the paranormal entity that governed the isolation of the void, a being that required a physical anchor to ground its kingdom into our reality. The quarantine is eternal, Elias. A voice hissed, resonating directly inside my skull like grinding tectonic plates. A dark ritual of transmutation was unfolding. I tried to reach for the emergency intercom, but my fingers were fused to the steel console. The paranormal gravity in the room shifted, pinning me against the central glass partition. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a gray, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of dark, cold quartz. I was not being infected. I was being integrated. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static monument to pay for the threshold I had dared to monitor. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final integration. The room was not a place of recovery. It was a factory for the void, and I was the chosen material to complete the circuit. I was being overwritten by an ancient cold logic that saw my consciousness only as a medium for the stone. I was the permanent record of the facility. The warden stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any industrial freezer. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my ribcage freeze into a solid block of marble. My heart gave one last heavy thud, a final organic beat, before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a component of the facility's architecture. One life for the containment, one stone for the eternal void, the entity whispered, its voice fading into a low, rhythmic hum that shook the foundations of the laboratory. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron in the heart of Antwerp. I would be the secret foundation of the room, a silent witness to the fear of men for centuries to come. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of ultraviolet light as the transformation reached my brain. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered the nearby glass monitors into dust. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull. I was no longer a doctor. I was the quarantine. I was the cold in the stone. I was the death that waits in the isolation. When the relief team arrives tomorrow, they will find the room silent. They will find the consoles untouched, but in the center of the unit, they will see a new ornament. A grim masterpiece of grey stone and burning eyes, forever guarding the sterile void. They will think it is a strange reaction to the pathogen. They will never know that I'm still there, feeling every vibration of the facility. A prisoner of the glass. The death had finally secured the lock, and the stone was eternal. The last toast at Blackwood Manor. My name is Arthur, and I spent 15 years as a senior executive for one of the oldest insurance firms in London. In our world, the annual office party was a sacred tradition. A night of expensive champagne, forced laughter, and the subtle sharpening of knives for the next promotion. But the celebration of 2023 was different. Our CEO, a man whose family tree was rooted deep in the occult history of England, decided we wouldn't be hosting the gala at a hotel. Instead, he took us to his ancestral estate in the windswept moors of Yorkshire. We arrived at the manor just as the sun was being swallowed by the grey, hungry horizon. The house was a jagged silhouette of Victorian stone and ivy that looked like grasping veins. Team building, the CEO had said with a smile that didn't reach his cold, glassy eyes. But as we stepped inside, the air didn't smell of party appetizers. It smelled of wet earth and ancient copper. The theme was a masquerade of the ancestors. We were all handed masks. Not plastic ones from a shop, but heavy, wooden carven faces with expressions of agony and ecstasy. Mine was the face of a weeping jester. As the music began, a discordant rhythmic thumping of drums that seemed to pulse from within the walls, the party took a surreal turn. To success, the CEO shouted, raising a chalice of dark, thick liquid. And to the blood that sustains the firm. We drank. I thought it was a vintage wine, but it tasted like iron and bitter herbs. Within minutes, the room began to blur. The shadows in the corners grew tall, stretching across the ceiling like living ink. My colleagues, usually so professional, began to dance with a violent, jerky intensity, their bodies twisting in ways that should have snapped bone. It wasn't an office party anymore. It was a ritual. I stumbled away from the dance floor, seeking air. In the library, I found the ledger. It wasn't a record of insurance policies. It was a book of contracts, soul contracts. For 300 years, the firm had maintained its wealth by sacrificing its most valuable assets every 25 years during a lunar transition. And tonight was the night. The CEO appeared in the doorway, his wooden mask now fused to his skin. "You were always a high achiever, Arthur," he hissed. "That's why your spirit will provide such a bountiful harvest." He began to chant in a tongue that sounded like stones grinding together in a deep well. The fun outside turned into screams. I looked through the cracked door and saw my co-workers being pulled into the floorboards by translucent, skeletal hands rising from the shadows. They weren't dying, they were being absorbed into the house itself, their faces becoming part of the ornate woodwork of the walls. I realized the masks were the anchors. They were enchanted objects designed to bind our life force to the manor. I tried to rip mine off, but it felt like I was tearing away my own skin. Blood trickled down my neck. Panic gave me a surge of adrenaline. I grabbed a heavy silver letter opener from the desk and, ignoring the searing pain, pried the mask from my face. A piece of my cheek came with it, but I was free. The house roared. The walls began to bleed a black, oily substance. I ran through the corridors as the guests, now nothing more than walking corpses in suits, tried to grab me. I burst through the front doors just as the moon turned a sickly, bruised red. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. When the sun rose, I looked back, but the manor was gone. There was only a scorched patch of earth and the distant sound of a single, mocking laugh on the wind. I am the only survivor. The firm liquidated overnight, and my colleagues were reported as missing in a tragic, unexplained bus accident. But I know where they are. Sometimes, when I'm in a quiet room, I can hear them. I can hear the rhythmic drumming, and I can feel the phantom weight of a wooden mask pressing against my soul. My name is Arthur, and I will never go to another office party, because I know that when the elite say they want to bring the team together, they sometimes mean they want to stitch your souls into the foundation of their power. The Whispering Peaks of Zakopane. My name is Adam, and I used to believe that the mountains were a place of healing. I grew up in the shadows of the high Tatras in Poland, and for years I worked as a mountain guide, leading thrill seekers through the jagged peaks of Zakopane. I loved the thin air, the silence of the pines, and the feeling of being closer to the stars. But after what happened last October, I realized that some silences are not peaceful. They are hungry, and some stars are not stars at all, but the watchful eyes of things that existed long before man ever dared to climb. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. I was leading a small group, a young couple from Warsaw and an older man named Marek, who claimed to be a historian specializing in Slavic folklore. We hiked deep into a dead zone, a valley the local Highlanders, the Gorale, avoid at all costs. They call it the Valley of the Unheard, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it speaks. As the sun dipped behind the granite peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange, we set up our camp near a circle of ancient, moss-covered stones. Marek seemed uneasy. He wasn't looking at the view. He was tracing the faint, jagged runes etched into the rock faces. "This isn't a natural formation, Adam," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is a seal, a tethering spell meant to keep the Povodnika, the Lady of the Midday, bound to the earth. But the magic is old. It's thinning." I laughed it off, chalking it up to his obsession with old myths. We lit a fire, ate our meal, and crawled into our tents. But the mountains don't sleep. Around 2 a.m., the temperature plummeted. It didn't just get cold. The air turned into ice that burned the lungs. Then the sound started. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of 100 wooden flutes playing out of tune, rising from the very dirt beneath our sleeping bags. I stepped out of my tent, and the sight froze my blood. The campfire wasn't orange anymore. It was burning with a pale, ghostly blue flame. The couple from Warsaw were standing at the edge of the clearing, their eyes wide and glazed, staring into the dark woods. They weren't moving. They weren't even breathing. "They've been chosen," Marek's voice came from behind me. He was kneeling by the stones, frantically pouring a circle of salt. Someone broke the silence. Someone brought a piece of the city's noise into this sacred place, and now the mountain wants its payment in breath. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog. She was impossibly tall, draped in tattered white rags that flowed like mountain mist. Her skin was the color of a dead man's fingernails, and where her face should have been, there was only a hollow void filled with swirling snow. This was no ghost. This was an ancient elemental entity, a creature of pure, malicious magic. She raised a hand, and the young man from Warsaw simply collapsed. Not like a man dying, but like a puppet whose strings were cut. His body didn't fall. It dissolved into a cloud of gray ash that was instantly sucked into the void of the creature's face. "Death here is a cycle," Marek screamed over the rising howl of the flutes. "She doesn't just kill, she harvests. She's the soul of the Zakopane Peaks, and she hasn't fed in a century." Marek grabbed an old iron dagger from his pack, covered in etched spells, and lunged at the entity. It was a suicide mission. The moment he touched her, the iron turned to liquid heat, and Marek was engulfed in a pillar of blue fire. He didn't scream. He just turned to ash, joining the young man in the creature's eternal winter. I did the only thing a coward could do. I ran. I didn't grab my gear. I didn't look back for the girl. I sprinted down the rocky slopes, my lungs screaming, the sound of those cursed flutes echoing in my skull. Every time I slipped, I felt cold. Invisible fingers brushing against my ankles, trying to pull me back into the valley of the unheard. I made it to the ranger station at dawn, half frozen and raving. They searched the valley, of course. They found our tents, our gear, and the stones. But they found no bodies, no ash, no Marek. To the police, it was a tragic disappearance. To me, it was a ritual. My name is Adam, and I don't go to the mountains anymore. I live in a windowless apartment in the middle of the city, surrounded by the hum of electricity and the roar of traffic. Because I know that as long as there is noise, she can't find me. But sometimes, when it rains in Zakopane and the wind blows south, I can hear a faint, out-of-tune flute playing behind my radiator. And I know she's still hungry. She's just waiting for the next camp to be pitched. The playground of whispering shadows. My name is Thomas, and I have spent 30 years as a night watchman in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. People think this city is beautiful with its Gothic spires and castle views, but they don't see what crawls beneath the mist when the tourists go home. I've seen things that would make a sane man burn his eyes out, but nothing haunts me more than the Greyfriars Children's Park. It was a small, iron-fenced playground tucked away in a corner of the old city, bordered by ancient stone walls and a forgotten graveyard. Local parents avoided it, claiming the equipment was unsafe, but we knew the truth. There was a stain on that land that no amount of holy water or fresh paint could scrub away. The story goes back to the 17th century, when a local occultist practiced a form of dark alchemy, trying to trade the innocence of youth for eternal life. He didn't just use spells, he used the very dirt where children played. He was eventually caught and executed, but his garden, as he called it, remained. Years later, the city built a playground over it, thinking they could bury the past under slides and swings. One rainy Tuesday in November, I was doing my rounds. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own boots. As I approached the park, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. The rhythmic metallic squeak of a swing set. Squeak, squeak, squeak. I shone my heavy flashlight through the iron bars. There, on the center swing, sat a small figure. A girl in a tattered Victorian dress, her hair matted with mud. She wasn't moving her legs, yet the swing moved with a violent, unnatural force. "Hey, the park is closed," I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't look at me. She just pointed at the merry-go-round. I turned my beam toward it. It began to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until the metal groaned in agony. There was no wind. There was no one pushing it. But as it spun, I saw shadows sitting on it, translucent, weeping shapes of children with hollow eyes. Suddenly, the girl spoke. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It echoed from the ground beneath my feet. "The master needs more breath, Thomas. The toll hasn't been paid in 100 years. I realized then that the symbols etched into the wooden climbing frame weren't graffiti. They were runes of binding. The entire playground was a giant mechanical sigil, a machine built to harvest the life force of anyone who stepped inside. The outbreak of unexplained childhood deaths in this neighborhood suddenly made sense. It wasn't disease, it was the park. I tried to back away, but the gate slammed shut. The swings wrapped their rusted chains around the bars like snakes. The air turned freezing, and I smelled the copper tang of fresh blood. From the sandbox, hands began to emerge, pale, skeletal hands made of grey earth and ancient bone. "A soul for the soil," the girl whispered. I grabbed my iron crucifix, the only thing that has ever kept me safe in this city, and began to recite the prayers my grandmother taught me. The ground shook. The merry-go-round flew off its axis, crashing into the stone wall with a sound like a thunderclap. For a second, I saw him, the occultist, standing in the center of the park, his face a swirling vortex of black smoke and screaming faces. I didn't stop praying. I didn't stop running until I hit the main road. The next morning, the city closed the park forever, citing structural instability. They paved it over with thick concrete, but if you go there at night, near the old wall in Edinburgh, you can still hear it. If you press your ear to the cold ground, you'll hear the faint, muffled sound of a child laughing. And then the sound of a shovel digging. I've quit my job since then. I don't go out after dark, because I know that concrete can't hold back what's hungry. And I know that one day, the playground will find a way to swing again. My name is Thomas, and this is why I never look at shadows in the park. Because sometimes, the shadows are looking back, waiting for a turn on the slide. The incineration of silence. A night in Portugal. The heat in the Sintra Mountains of Portugal does not merely burn. It devours the oxygen until the air feels like molten lead in your lungs. My name is Ricardo, and I have served as a firefighter in these ancient hills for 15 years. I have faced infernos that turned forests into ash in seconds. But tonight, the fire at the abandoned Quinta da Regalera estate is not burning with wood and resin. It is a paranormal combustion, a cold violet flame that rises from the stone itself, defying every law of thermodynamics I have ever known. It started at 2:45 a.m. We received a distress signal from the depths of the estate's initiation well, a spiraling subterranean tower that leads into the belly of the earth. When my team reached the entrance, the air grew stagnant, turning into a pressurized vacuum that smelled of scorched copper and ancient, pulverized mineral. The temperature outside was 40 degrees, but inside the well, a hollow frost began to form on our protective gear. I felt the presence, a paranormal density so thick it made the marrow in my bones vibrate with a sickening high-pitched frequency. This was not a forest fire. This was a terminal opening in the bedrock. I descended the spiral staircase alone, my flashlight cutting through a mist that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The beam was distorted, bending toward the center of the well as if gravity had become a liquid vortex. At the bottom, standing on the mosaic floor, was a figure that did not belong to the physical world. It was the architect of the Yash, a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mercury. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the shadows. This was the paranormal entity that governed the friction of the core, a being that required a physical anchor to ground its void into our reality. "The fire requires a vessel, Ricardo," a voice hissed, resonating directly inside my skull like grinding tectonic plates. A dark ritual of transmutation was unfolding. I tried to turn and run back up the stairs, but my heavy boots were fused to the stone floor. The paranormal gravity in the well shifted, pinning me against the damp limestone wall. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a gray, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of dark, gold quartz. I was not being burned. I was being integrated. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static monument to mark the boundary of its subterranean kingdom. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final integration. The well was not a tourist site. It was a factory for the void, and I was the chosen material to complete the circuit. I was being overwritten by an ancient cold logic that saw my consciousness only as a medium for the stone. The architect stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any forest fire I had ever fought. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my ribcage freeze into a solid block of marble. My heart gave one last, heavy thud, a final organic beat before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a component of the mountain's architecture. One life for the flame, one stone for the eternal silence. The entity whispered, its voice fading into a low, rhythmic hum that shook the foundations of Sintra. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron in the heart of Portugal. I would be the secret foundation of the well, a silent witness to the curiosity of men for centuries to come. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of ultraviolet light as the transformation reached my brain. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered the nearby stone arches into dust. I felt the final crack, at the base of my skull. I was no longer a firefighter named Ricardo. I was the well. I was the cold in the stone. I was the death that waits in the ash. When the sun rises over the Sintra Hills tomorrow, my team will find the fire extinguished. They will find the well empty, but at the very bottom, they will see a new statue standing against the wall. A grim masterpiece of grey stone and burning eyes, forever holding a fire axe that is now part of its arm. They will think it is a forgotten relic of the estate's mysterious past. They will never know that I am still there, feeling every tremor of the earth, a prisoner of the stone. The death had finally settled the alarm, and the silence was eternal. The secret ingredient of Blackwood Manor. My name is Julian, and I was once considered the finest sous chef in all of Lyon, France. In the culinary world, we often speak of soul being the key to a perfect dish. But after what I witnessed in the summer of 2024, I realized that some souls are never meant to be consumed. I'm writing this from a hidden cellar, my hands still trembling as I smell the faint, iron-like scent of blood on my apron, a scent that no amount of soap can wash away. It began with an invitation to the Blackwood Manor, a secluded estate perched on the jagged cliffs of the Amalfi Coast in Italy. The owner, a reclusive aristocrat named Count Marcello, was looking for a personal chef to prepare a centennial feast. The pay was more than I would make in a decade, but the conditions were strange. I was to bring no ingredients of my own, and I was never to enter the pantry after midnight. When I arrived, the beauty of the Mediterranean was overshadowed by the oppressive gloom of the manor. The kitchen was a masterpiece of copper and stone, but the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Marcello was a gaunt man with skin like yellowed parchment and eyes that seemed to reflect a fire that wasn't there. "Tonight, Julian," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves, "you will cook the pastum animarum. The recipe is ancient, it requires precision, devotion, and a specific kind of seasoning." He handed me a leather-bound book. The pages weren't paper, they were thin sheets of dried skin. The ink was a dark, pulsating crimson. As I read the recipe, my blood ran cold. It wasn't cooking, it was a ritual. It called for herbs that only grew in graveyards and a broth simmered for 72 hours with the bones of the unbaptized. I thought it was a joke, a dark, eccentric theatrical display of the rich. I was wrong. On the third night, I broke the rule. I entered the pantry at 1 a.m. The room was larger than the kitchen itself, filled with jars of preserving fluids. But they weren't holding vegetables. Inside the glass were human eyes, tongues, and hearts, all twitching as if still alive. In the center of the room, Marcello stood over a boiling cauldron, chanting in a tongue that sounded like bones grinding together. He was pouring a shimmering black bile into the pot, a liquid shadow that defied gravity. "The magic is in the consumption, Julian," he said without turning around. "To eat is to dominate, to digest is to become." He turned to me, and his face was shifting. His jaw elongated, and I saw rows of needle-like teeth. He wasn't just a man. He was a vessel for a hunger that had lasted centuries. He explained that the great sickness that took his family generations ago wasn't a plague, but a botched immortality spell. Now, they had to eat life to prevent their own bodies from turning into dust. The feast began at 3 a.m. The guests arrived in black carriages, skeletal figures dressed in fine silks. their skin translucent and their movements jerky, like puppets. I was forced to serve the dish. As they ate, the color returned to their cheeks, but the light in the room died. The candles burned black. Then came the final course, the sacrifice. Marcello looked at me with a hunger that bypassed the stomach and went straight for the spirit. A chef always pours himself into his work, he grinned. They didn't want my cooking anymore. They wanted the chef as the dessert. The doors slammed shut. The silver cutlery on the table began to float, turning into jagged daggers. I survived only by throwing a container of highly flammable truffle oil into the enchanted hearth, creating a blast of blue fire that disrupted their ritual. In the chaos, as the guests shrieked in a frequency that shattered every glass in the manor, I ran. I jumped from the kitchen window into the freezing tyrannical sea below. I'm safe for now, but I can't eat. Every time I see meat, I see Stefan's eyes. Every time I smell soup, I hear the chanting of the dead. Marcello is still out there, and he's still hungry. He's looking for a new chef, a new soul to spice his eternal life. If you are a cook and you receive an invitation to a cliffside manor in Italy, starve. It is better to die of hunger than to become the meal. Pichao Topol, the Iron Revenant, a night in the ruins of Katowice. The soot-stained skies of Katowice, Poland, do not offer rain. They offer a heavy industrial grief that settles into the cracks of the earth. My name is Thomas, and I'm a scavenger of forgotten industrial skeletons. I specialize in the extraction of high-grade copper from the carcasses of Soviet-era factories. Tonight, I have entered the Stalmetal 4 refinery, a gargantuan complex of rusted iron and shattered glass that was sealed 40 years ago after a series of unexplained structural failures. The local legends speak of a resonance within the furnace, a paranormal hunger that was never satisfied by coal or ore. It started at 2:12 a.m. I was cutting through a primary steam pipe in the lower smelting chamber when the air in the factory grew stagnant. The smell of oil and rust was suddenly replaced by the sharp metallic tang of scorched ozone and ancient parched mineral. I felt the presence, a paranormal density so thick it made the marrow in my bones vibrate with a sickening high-pitched frequency. This was not the settling of old metal. This was a terminal opening in the very heart of the refinery. A vibration from a plane of existence that ignores the laws of gravity. I shone my tactical light into the yawning mouth of the central blast furnace. The beam did not penetrate the darkness. It was bent by the air itself, curving toward the iron grate as if the atmosphere had turned into liquid lead. From the depths of the cold soot, a figure manifested, the foreman of the void. It was a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mercury. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the shadows of the machinery. This was the paranormal entity that governed the friction of industry, a being that required a physical anchor to ground its kingdom into our reality. The shift is eternal, Thomas. A voice hissed, resonating directly inside my skull like grinding tectonic plates. A dark ritual of transmutation was unfolding. I tried to turn and run toward the heavy steel exit, but my boots were fused to the iron floor. The paranormal gravity in the chambers shifted, pinning me against a massive support pillar of black quartz. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a grey, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of dark, gold quartz. I was not being crushed. I was being integrated. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static monument to pay for the threshold I had crossed. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final integration. The factory was not a ruin. It was a factory for the void. And I was the chosen material to complete the circuit. I was being overwritten by an ancient cold logic that saw my consciousness only as a medium for the stone and the iron. I was the permanent record of the plant. The foreman stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any furnace fire. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my ribcage freeze into a solid block of marble. My heart gave one last, heavy thud, a final organic beat before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a component of the factory's architecture. One life for the production, one stone for the eternal gear. The entity whispered, its voice fading into a low, rhythmic hum that shook the foundations of Katowice. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron in the heart of Poland. I would be the secret foundation of the refinery, a silent witness to the decay of the world for centuries to come. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of ultraviolet light as the transformation reached my brain. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek of cracking iron that shattered every window in the facility. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull. I was no longer a scavenger named Thomas. I was the factory. I was the coal in the stone. I was the death that waits in the rust. When the sun rises over Poland tomorrow, the factory will look as it always has, a silent, rusted ghost. But in the center of the smelting chamber, a new ornament stands, a grim masterpiece of grey stone and burning eyes, forever fused to the iron pillar. They will never know that I am still there, feeling every vibration of the earth, a prisoner of the gear. The death had finally finished the production, and the stone was eternal. The symphony of the iron vein, the effort of the subterranean void. In the modern rain-slicked sprawl of London, deep beneath the bustling streets of Whitechapel, lay a decommissioned section of the underground that had been walled off since the mid-Victorian era. Julian, a senior structural engineer for the city's transit authority, had been sent to assess the stability of these ancient arches for a new, high-speed rail expansion. To Julian, the world was a series of stress tests, load-bearing capacities, and geological surveys. He laughed at the ghost stories told by the older track workers about the flicker in the tunnel, a presence that allegedly fed on the electricity of passing trains. He was a man of concrete and iron until his excavation team breached a double-layered wall of lead-lined bricks, revealing a hidden alcove that emitted a rhythmic, suffocating heat that no ventilation system could cool. The evening sky above the city was a bruised, heavy purple, but inside the damp, claustrophobic tunnel, the atmosphere shifted into something predatory. The air, typically smelling of ozone and wet soot, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar. and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the very iron rivets of the Victorian support beams, staining the grime-covered walls a steaming crimson. The digital readouts on Julian's handheld structural scanner began to glitch, flickering with fiery glyphs that defied any known programming language. This must be a pocket of pressurized methane or an old chemical leak from a forgotten tannery, Julian muttered, though his lungs burned with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes widened in absolute terror when he saw his own shadow against the brickwork. It had detached itself from his feet, growing eyes of blue magma that pulsed with a hatred spanning 10 millennia. From the lead-lined alcove, a dense living mass of black smoke began to pour. A vortex of embers that coiled around the tunnel's tracks like glowing serpentine chains. From this darkness emerged a Nifrit, a Jinni of the scorched abyss, whose essence had been bound to these subterranean depths by occultists long before the first steam engine had ever rattled through the dark. The Ifrit did not seek to inhabit Julian's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the steel tracks and copper wiring began to warp and melt like wax. The Jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the city's entire subway grid, connecting its essence to every rail, signal, and power line in the metropolis. You thought your iron cages and copper wires could contain the original raw little clerk of stone, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the lenses of the heavy industrial floodlights. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This tunnel is my spine. I will transform every station, every platform, and every moving carriage into a furnace of black flame. I will burn the world through the very arteries you use to move. The Jinni began the liturgy of the molten transit, a sorcery designed to transmute the kinetic energy of the city's movement into physical, supernatural fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Julian, whose mind was trained to calculate the precise point of structural collapse and to redirect massive amounts of pressure, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of stress redirection to neutralize the entity's manifestation. Julian did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent structural anchor. He projected his identity into the molecular structure of the tunnel's iron and brick, creating a logic trap where the Jinni was perpetually in transit, but never allowed to reach a destination. He did not cage the Jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable seal within the tunnel's history. At dawn, the tunnel was found in absolute stillness. The iron tracks were cold, covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt in the morning sun. Julian had vanished. However, the track workers say that now the trains passing nearby never experience delays, and a strange, rhythmic humming can be heard beneath the ground. Julian became the guardian of the vein, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of suspended stasis. He remains there, in the silence of the iron, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the heart of the tunnels. The Vault of Absolute Zero, a night in Zurich. The vault of the Swiss National Bank does not merely contain gold. It preserves a silence that has been frozen since the dawn of commerce. My name is Julian, and I'm a professional intruder of high-security voids. I do not use explosives. I use the silence. But tonight, as I descend into the deepest subterranean level of the Zurich branch, the air does not feel like oxygen. It feels like a pressurized liquid, heavy with the scent of oxidized copper and a paranormal chill that bites through my thermal gear. It started at 2:24 a.m. I had bypassed the biometric locks and neutralized the seismic sensors of the main archive. When the 12-ton steel door swung open, the presence hit me like a physical hammer. The temperature plummeted into a stagnant, hollow frost that smelled of scorched ozone and parched mineral. I felt the resonance, a high-pitched vibration rising from the bedrock beneath the bank, a frequency from a plane of existence that ignores the laws of gravity. This was not a heist anymore. I had broken into a terminal. I shone my tactical light into the darkness. There were no bars of gold. In the center of the room sat a single, massive monolith of translucent obsidian, humming with a rhythmic guttural pulse. From the surface of the stone, a figure manifested, not by movement, but by crystallizing out of the very shadows. It was the broker of the void, a towering silhouette composed of shifting mineral shards and frozen mercury. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the dark. This was the paranormal entity that governed the weight of all things, a being that required a physical anchor to ground its kingdom into our reality. "The transaction is mandatory, Julian," a voice hissed, resonating directly inside my skull like grinding tectonic plates. A dark ritual of transmutation was unfolding. I tried to turn and run back to the elevator, but my boots were fused to the concrete floor. The paranormal gravity in the room shifted, pinning me against the obsidian monolith. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a gray, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of dark, cold quartz. I was not being attacked. I was being integrated. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static monument to pay for the threshold I had crossed. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final integration. The bank was not a sanctuary for wealth. It was a factory for the void, and I was the chosen material to complete the circuit. I was being overwritten by an ancient cold logic that saw my consciousness only as a medium for the stone. The broker stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any winter gale. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my ribcage freeze into a solid block of marble. My heart gave one last heavy thud, a final organic beat, before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a component of the vault's architecture. One life for the entry, one stone for the eternal balance, the entity whispered, its voice fading into a low, rhythmic hum that shook the foundations of Zurich. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron in the darkness beneath the city. I would be the secret guardian of the vault, a silent witness to the greed of men for centuries to come. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of ultraviolet light as the transformation reached my brain. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered the security monitors in the hallway above. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull. I was no longer a man named Julian. I was the vault. I was the cold in the stone. I was the death that waits for the thief. When the bank staff arrive in the morning, they will find the security systems fully operational. They will find the vault door sealed. But in the corner of the deepest chamber, they will see a new ornament, a grim masterpiece of grey stone and burning eyes, forever fused to the floor. They will think it is a modern art installation for the elite clients. They will never know that I'm still there, feeling every vibration of the city above, a prisoner of the heist. The death had finally settled the account, and the stone was eternal. The cursed chauffeur of Montenegro. My name is Victor, and for 20 years, I was the most trusted driver for the elite of Podgorica, Montenegro. I have navigated the treacherous serpentine roads of the Domitor Mountains in the dead of night, and I have whispered secrets into the rear-view mirrors of men who controlled the fate of nations. But there is one road I will never drive again, and one passenger who refuses to leave the backseat of my soul. It happened on a cold, jagged night in the Northern Highlands, near the ancient ruins of a forgotten monastery. I was hired by a man who didn't have a name, only a heavy, silver-topped cane and an aura that felt like the stillness of a fresh grave. He spoke in a dialect so old it sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. He offered me a chest of gold coins, the kind you only see in museums, for a single night of service. "Drive me to the Black Lake," he whispered, his breath smelling of frankincense and dried blood. "And no matter what you hear in the back, do not look in the mirror. If you see my eyes, you've become the vehicle." I was greedy. I was a fool. I accepted. As we wound higher into the mountains, the atmosphere changed. The moonlight turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the mist didn't just hang in the air. It crawled across the windshield like skeletal fingers. About an hour into the journey, the chanting began. My passenger wasn't just sitting, he was vibrating. He began to recite incantations in a language that made the engine of my Mercedes groan in agony. This wasn't a businessman. He was a necromancer and practitioner of the Krnamagija, the black magic of the Balkan peaks. Suddenly, the car grew impossibly heavy. The tires screeched against the asphalt as if we were hauling a mountain. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, and the scent of ozone filled the cabin. Through the partition, I heard the sound of wet, tearing meat. "Victor," a voice called out. It wasn't the man's voice. It was the voice of my father, who had died 10 years prior. "Victor, look at me, I'm cold." My hands shook on the steering wheel. I remembered the warning. Do not look in the mirror. But the human mind is a fragile thing when faced with the impossible. My eyes flickered upward, just for a millisecond. In the reflection, I didn't see my father. I didn't see the old man. I saw a void, a swirling vortex of shadows where the man's face should have been. And in the center of that void were two burning white eyes that belonged to something that had never been born. The moment our gazes met, the curse took hold. My skin began to harden, turning the color of gold chrome. My veins felt as though they were being filled with hot lead and gasoline. I tried to scream, but the only sound that came out was the roar of a revving engine. I wasn't just driving the car anymore. I was becoming a part of the machine. The leather of the seats felt like my own flesh. The headlights became my eyes, piercing through the darkness with a supernatural, predatory light. The necromancer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The ritual is complete," he hissed. "Every ghost needs a carriage, and every carriage needs a soul to bind it to the earth." We reached the Black Lake, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even step out. I watched through the windshield as the man walked into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. I was left alone on the shore, trapped inside the metal carcass of the vehicle. Now I am the cursed chauffeur. I am bound to these mountain passes, forced to pick up the hitchhikers who wander too far into the mist. If you're ever in Montenegro, and you see a black sedan idling by the side of the road with its lights flickering in a rhythmic heartbeat pattern, do not get in. I can see you through the glass. I want to tell you to run, but my mouth is a grill of silver, and my heart is a piston. I am hungry for miles, and the magic that binds me demands a new driver every century. The seat next to me is empty, and the door is already opening for you. My name is Victor, and I am the road, the car, and the death that follows. Don't look in the mirror, whatever you do. Don't look at me.